So, continuing our discussion on civil society, we are going to be looking at two examples of civil society. Um, we will be looking at one of our country cases, Mexico, discussing a little bit more about the social partners in Mexico, and then also taking more historical view of the development of civil society in Mexico. But before we move on, I return to the textbook, Return to the War and the Blood, and we look at the chapter on activists also. So let's start off here with Mexico. Um, with Mexico, we have to be remember that in Mexico, for about 70 years, we had that one single party, PRI, in control. What that tended to do is it limited the um, opportunity for independent civil society groups to develop. Um, sorry. Mm, and there was civil society going on, but it was usually funded heavily and controlled by one single party. And that's been one of the problem of civil society in civil society in Mexico or anywhere. Um, there was civil society going on, but it was usually controlled by one single party. And civil society, we would say, is underdeveloped in Mexico. It's underdeveloped because it was all channeled into one single party, which was seen being too close to the government. So, for instance, in Mexico, we are going to review this. I don't think it's necessary for you to remember the names. It's not so necessary to remember the names. It's just kind of a general tendency of civil societies in terms of politically where the groups align. So here we have the business associations, uh, Concanaco and Concami. Um, Too. Then again, it doesn't really matter the difference between the two, but just understand that the business groups were still very close to PRI. And that gives you an example or sense of this idea of corporatismo, because we usually would say business associations aren't linked too closely with the groups that are parties that too further to the left. Um, Not the case in Mexico. Even if the PRI was not very centrist party, sometimes it espoused ideas that were pretty much kind of more on the left, such as the land distribution and things of that nature. We do know that PRI was heavily reliant on money coming from these businesses. And these businesses were heavily reliant on the PRI also, protecting the business in the sense from foreign competition. So there was a mutual relationship. So they were very close, um, the business associations to the PRI. In contrast to that, we have employer association, the Coparmex, and this was a group. Again, the business association and employer associations are sometimes very close together, but it seems that employer associations are going to be much more focused on policies of how you treat workers, whereas business associations may also ask question about what is our foreign trade policy, and things like that. So again, these employers associations, on the other hand, started to become more independent and not in tune so much with the PRI. I think what they objected was the PRI, often in return for votes of the voters, was not passing legislation to push up wages, and employers didn't want that, and they wanted more free market policies. So, party, as the PAN party, the more business friendly conservative party, started to develop in opposition to PRI, this Copermax really drifted over to the right, um drifted over to the right more, and was happy to find political party that was more tuned to simply free market policy goals. On the other side, as far as the trade union themselves, the Central Trade Union Confederation (CTM) of Mexico, it was strongly controlled by PRI. To this system of cooptation, that if you wanted to do well in trade union structure, you had to kind of loyal to the PRI and make sure that you are showing that your workers are also voting for the PRI. However, not all trade unions were always happy with the policies coming from the PRI and from the government, and this led to the rise of at least one smaller rival trade union, um, representing lots of different groups, and that's is UNT. But UNT is a lot smaller than the CMT, maybe only a third of the size. But it also shows again the development of that simply shows that despite the fact of the PRI really controlling the union structure very heavily in Mexico, there was still some room for some independent civil society. Independent from, I say here, the political party. But since the political party is controlled by the government, I would say independent from the government was allowed to rise. So that's where we are with that. I think a little bit more interestingly, I would like to look at um the article on the rise of civil society in Mexico. Again, with this idea being in Mexico, the civil society is rather underdeveloped, not very independent from the government. Again, you want to go all the way back to the Boras reading. Um you would say, yeah, well, that's the tradition that you inherited from a Catholic country and having the patron client relationship from the Latin society. Uh, those always mean that people are subservient and just listen to what the government tells it to do. And so, again, let's explore how Mexico has mm, moved away from that, and the people have started to rise. And this article, we look at the rise of civil society. um, there are three big movements in Mexican history to chart the rise of civil society. The first one, you remember, yes, it's 1968 protest, right? There were a series of protests in 1968. If you see, there was a time the whole world was there were protests throughout, and back home at US there was campuses where there were protests. but also in much of Western Europe. Protest against certainly war that was going on. One was the big one, the US Vietnam War, but also a little bit against the old established practice that tended to favor elites within the society. Right. Making it difficult to get into universities or that only certain curriculum was taught, whatever your gripe were, and certainly a limited access for women or indigenous groups to govern. All these things mm, were led to students' protest. In Mexico, it was no different. Some of the most violent protests took place in 1968, really led by students and largely by students. Now, the article points out this was a big movement of protest. It was responded to with a little bit of violence by the government, certainly. There was a massacre in a big square, but what would happen is the government simply said, we would like to speak with the student leaders, and lot of student leaders uh, then went to speak with the government, and they were bought off by the government. When you say brought off, it doesn't you just it doesn't just get money in your hand. It usually means you get a job, right? It's not like people just sell their souls quite easily. But the government will come to you and they will say, listen, I know you have a strong interest in indigenous rights, but protesting is not the way to go about it. It wouldn't solve, it wouldn't like to work. Um, it's it might offer government might offer like, would you like to work in our Ministry of Indigenous Affairs, making sure that government passes policy that help the indigenous population. Now, in one sense, it might be a good because you have people who are quite passionate about these issues working there. But in another sense, it is certainly keeps them from being an antagonistic towards the government because they are now in the government. That tends to subdue calls for change. Another group of these were also given scholarships. Listen, you guys want to get wild? Go to Germany, go to Spain and study there, but get out of the country. Now, the good thing that maybe come out of this is that some of the people who were unhappy with this sprouted into what we call community action groups, saying that the government really doesn't listen to us very much, but it was very nice protesting here with you. It's nice to know that there are other people who have similar interests to us. Shall we meet once a month, right, at the local school and talk about issues of whatever you know, education, law and order, water access, whatever it might be they want to talk about. This kind of set the ball rolling, but to get the actual policy goal they wanted, uh, the 1968 protests really didn't achieve that very much at all. See here, we can see some of the images of the protests, and of course some government response with the military coming out in this large Mexican plaza back in 1968. Right. The second movement that they talk about um, is 1985 earthquake. Now again, essentially a very strong earthquake in Mexico, and it was near Mexico City. and killed a lot of people.